Looking at nature has become rather bittersweet because while I still appreciate its beauty as I always have and still fascinated by the ecology of ecosystems, I can't help but wonder how long it will all last. Climate change is affecting many agricultural commodities and will continue to do so. You know, the world could live without coffee. Probably a lot of people couldn't live without rice and wheat, so those sorts of crops are probably more important. But coffee is just one of many really that are going to be affected, or are being affected already. It's not a future thing.
So what you're saying is you can live without your coffee in the morning, but...
I think we could all live without coffee, maybe not happily. My name's Lesley Hughes. I'm a biologist, an ecologist by background. I work at Macquarie University as an academic. I've been studying the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems with a focus on Australia for many years, more than 20. I was very privileged to be part of the IPCC 4th and 5th assessment reports. I was on the Australasian chapter and I was in charge of the biodiversity section as well as several other sections. So I worked with a small group of other people to put those chapters together.
You know, I would like the viewers to understand that you are human beings too.
Yeah.
You are not just a scientist or a famous person like, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio or in an ivory tower in a you know, wealthy country. But you also are in your daily life and with your family very much, you know, worried and affected by what's going on. So that actually the people watching are thinking, well, you know, if this person who's very knowledgeable is, you know, I mean, to show you in a light that's like, she's not very different to me, you know, as the viewer, you know, I'm very much part of the same.
Scientists are human beings, you know, and we have families and we have triumphs and concerns and worries and we make mistakes and we're not perfectly objective about anything because that's just not what humans are, you know, we're as flawed as anybody else. So the more knowledge you have, the more worried you can be. You know, it's like a doctor becoming a hypochondriac about their own health, you know. Most doctors that I know, and I know a lot because my husband is in the medical area, you know, every little twinge, well, a lot of us would regard that as a twinge and a doctor would know that actually it could be something quite serious. So we're just like anybody else in that respect. You know, yes, we might have more knowledge about this particular area and it's, in our view, very important. But we have the same worries and concerns and joys and triumphs and bad days as anybody else on the planet. Well, I guess we have to go back to the Industrial Revolution to look at the root cause of where we are now. When it was discovered that coal was abundant and a very efficient and cheap form of energy relative to what had been before. So we can thank coal, really, for the rise of the industrial developed world and the great increase in wealth. And that in itself is a problem because, of course, once humans get wealthy and get things and get used to things, they're very reluctant to give them up. So as time went on and we put more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the heat trapping properties of those gases just started to change the Earth's climate system. That's been accelerating, of course, over the last century, especially over the last few decades, which brings us to where we are now, where we have had the last 4 years in a row are the hottest ever on record. We're seeing a huge increase in the severity and frequency of the sorts of extreme events, climatic weather events, that really cause impacts. Certainly these extreme events are becoming more frequent, and all these things have been predicted for a long time because we understand the basics of the science actually very well. So scientists have been saying for decades that this is what was going to happen in the future. We're now in the future, and those predictions are now observations. So the sorts of extreme events that have always happened are now occurring more often.
To me, that should be the number one discussion that everyone should be having on a daily basis, not to become completely paranoid and anxious and but actually doing something, and of course including with the media, which I'm part of, but to actually,
Look, I can understand the feeling that a lot of people have that come to this topic and realise the import of it. That yes, we should be talking about it all the time, every day, to the exclusion of all else. The fact is humans can't do that. There's a lot of climate change fatigue, just as there is fatigue about any topic, whether it be the refugee crisis or the GFC or whatever. Well, it's not a matter of having a choice or not. Of course, we do have a choice at an individual level. But I think it actually goes against human nature to be able to focus exclusively and somewhat obsessively on the one thing, regardless of how important it is. And, as an individual, I don't think about climate change all the time either, because I simply can't. It would not be mentally healthy. So it's very understandable, I think, that people can't talk about it all the time, don't want to talk about it all the time, and indeed, in my view, shouldn't talk about it all the time. We should talk about it a lot more. We should have it underpinning all of our actions, but obsession isn't a very healthy way to approach any important topic, I don't think. To be able to keep going in a healthy mental fashion, one has to corral some of those thoughts to one part of one's brain sometime and actually focus on other things as well. So there are important issues in the world other than climate change. I do think climate change is the issue, because when we don't have a habitable planet, well then all issues will become somewhat secondary. So it is the number one issue, but at the same time, there are all sorts of day-to-day things in our lives. We have to operate our lives. We worry about our health and the health of our children and their education and security and safety. Many aspects of those things are linked, not every aspect. So there has to be a balance, and to stay mentally healthy, to be able to make a difference, one must look after one's own mental state as well as one's physical state.
How do you think, as part of nature, this humanity or human beings are affected by all those changes, those dramatic changes that we're talking about?
Well, I think it depends on entirely who you are and where you live. And the great social injustice of climate change is that it's people like you and I, relatively wealthy middle class, living in comfort and using a lot of energy and a lot of other resources that are actually the root cause of what we're seeing. However, we are also in a position of being able to adapt and being relatively unaffected in most of the time by the sorts of climatic changes that we're seeing. Of course, it's the developing world where there are people who are subsistence agricultural farmers, who are living in low-lying deltas or low-lying islands in the Pacific, or who are, much closer to nature for their daily lives, those people are not only seeing the impacts because they're being affected by them right now, but are also more powerless to prevent them. So Nicholas Stern in the Stern report called climate change the biggest market failure of all time, and that's what he was talking about. He was talking about social injustice, that people like you and I can go home to our nice solid brick houses, we can turn on our air conditioning and be relatively comfortable, even with a lot of things happening outside most of the time, unless we're in the path of a bushfire or a major storm, where a lot of other people in the world, the majority of the world's population who live much closer to nature, don't have those luxuries. Well, I'm a biologist, so I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I understand a bit about human nature from an evolutionary perspective. And most humans are, by their nature, selfish beings. They think short term. And if you're selfish and think short term, if you're an executive of Exxon, you'll be thinking about your next bonus and your next shareholders meeting, your next annual general meeting. You're not thinking about somebody's grandkids in the Bangladeshi Delta. That's just out of your sphere of caring. So, and that's essentially the problem. Humans are short term. They are selfish in an evolutionary sense. Altruism is actually quite rare in the natural world. That's the nature of the beast. So I actually think it's quite understandable at a base level, the place that we've got to. That doesn't mean I think it's a good thing, but I understand how we got there. There's a lot of inertia in our energy system because of the infrastructure and the financial capital that is built up over time. Changing that overnight is pretty impossible, even if people wanted to. So I think we are going against the flow that has built up over the last 300 years or so of a developed way of life that relies on a coal-fired power station with wires taking electricity to other places. So there's a lot of that to be overcome and to change, and that doesn't happen overnight. Now, in many parts of the world, renewable energy is actually megawatt for megawatt cheaper than fossil fuel derived energy, which is a great thing, and the more renewables that are built, the economies of scale will make that even cheaper. But we still have a very big legacy to overcome. One of the problems with the whole system is that the size of the Earth system means there's a lot of lag in the system. So the climate that we're experiencing right now has basically been baked in by the greenhouse gas emissions over the last 2 to 3 decades. Similarly, what we're doing now is going to affect the weather in the next 3 decades. So most of what we're talking about in terms of taking action now to reduce emissions actually won't have an impact, successful or unsuccessful, until maybe the middle of this century. So once again, that's a pretty difficult thing to do because the sorts of things that I'm working to change won't actually, even if I'm successful, take effect until probably after I'm gone. So that once again is part of the problem. If you could just turn off a tap and have things better straight away, well, that would be a great thing. Climate change is not like that. It's a much bigger ship to turn around than that. The analogy I like to use sometimes is that, it's a bit like trying to lose weight. Everybody knows how to lose weight. You've got to eat less of bad things and move more. Now, given that knowledge, which everybody has, we still have an obesity crisis. Why is that? Because knowledge is not the only thing you need. You need to act on that knowledge. And it's not like you can act once on that knowledge. You have to keep acting on that knowledge. Your weight is an accumulation of millions and millions of individual decisions you have made over your previous few years about what you've eaten and how much you've exercised. The climate is like that. It's a result of billions and billions of individual decisions. And we all know, if we get faced with a big bit of delicious looking chocolate cake, it's very hard to resist, and it's very easy to say, well, I'll just eat this and I'll eat less tomorrow. But often we don't. So, if individuals have trouble controlling their own weight, and many people do, most people do, this is that problem writ millions of times larger.
Is it the end of humanity, Lesley, or potentially the end of humanity?
Potentially, yes, at least for lots of humanity. I suspect that even in a runaway greenhouse world, there'll be pockets of the planet and a few civilizations that may be able to limp through until things turn around. And they will turn around if we don't have any people putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere eventually. The analogy I like to think about is a little bit different to that. It also involves going downhill in a car or a bus, but it's about heading towards a cliff in a fog, and you don't know where the cliff is because you can't see very well. You know it's there, but you don't know how quickly you need to apply the brakes. So some people in the bus are saying we need to apply the brakes now to be safe because the cliff might be very soon. And others are saying, I really think we should redecorate because I don't like the colour of this upholstery. So that's the situation we have, and it comes back to what you were saying before about, how much should we worry about going downhill versus redecorating the inside of the bus. There's an awful lot of people worrying about redecorating. There's a million things that need to be done. I think climate change scientists continually raise awareness of the issue. We've been doing that for decades, and it's been somewhat effective, but not completely effective. I think as these severe weather events continue to become more obvious and continue to affect more and more people, there'll be greater awareness. It takes a good catastrophe to really focus people's minds. But that's only the first stage. Knowing the problem, it's like knowing you're overweight is just step one. Step two is to do something about it. And because climate change is coming from a multitude of sources, then there has to be a multitude of actions. We are developing some incredible technology, and that will continue. And indeed, I actually think it'll be the engineers. If anybody's going to save us, it's going to be the engineers actually developing technology that will make decisions about reducing fossil fuel use both cheaper and easier. We have to make it easy for people. Once again, it's like losing weight. If it's too difficult, people won't do it. If you come up with some magic diet that makes it easy for people, then it will happen. I think increasingly money is obviously becoming more and more important as energy production from renewables becomes cheaper. Markets are being affected, and money does make the world go around, unfortunately, much as we would like to think otherwise, but that's just the way it is. And I think social awareness is changing as well. So all of those things have to change kind of simultaneously. The problem is that things are changing, but as you indicated, not fast enough to avoid the worst of the impacts. I do like cooking. I have an enormous collection of recipes. It sort of oppressed me a little bit, but you're right, Faustina. I'm going to start crying now.
Actually, the onion that actually brings a thought to my mind.
Yes.
Tackling climate change.
One onion at a time.
Is it one layer of the onion at a time? Is that how it feels?
Yeah, I sometimes, to me it's building a brick wall, and you build it one brick at a time, and sometimes the bricks fall over and somebody bashes the wall down and you start again and put a few more bricks in the wall. So
and on the
sometimes
subject,
it feels like one step forward, two steps back. Talk about sustainable. This wooden spoon I bought in Turkey in 1989. I'm still using it. Most surveys find that the level of outright denialism of climate science is actually a relatively small part of the population. Unfortunately, it does include people that do have power in many developed countries. I think denialism is actually quite understandable. And the analogy that I use, it's the human condition. Everybody knows they're going to die one day. But we don't think about death every day. Once again, that comes back to that mental health question that we talked about earlier. Because if we keep thinking about death, we don't live our lives the way we should. Thinking about, I think denialism is a protective mechanism. Nobody wants to think the worst is just around the corner. And I think for some people that protective mechanism is stronger. The demographic in which denialism is strongest tends to be older men, and older men that have had careers or continue to have careers in positions of power. And what climate change represents is this scary, somewhat unknowable force that they can't control. And so it's easier to deny that it's happening than to actually face up to it.
Of course.
But I also do think that focusing on denialists and denialism is actually counterproductive. Often people say to me after a talk, what do you say to the denialists? And my answer is nothing at all. If I haven't said enough already, and if thousands of my fellow climate change scientists haven't said enough already and presented enough evidence, there's no point wasting our breath on that group of people. I would rather be talking to the so-called converted, the people that accept climate science, accept that there are impacts and accept that those impacts are going to get worse, because my focus is trying to move people who are concerned into people who are active. We could all be sitting around on the couch going, oh, I'm really, really worried about climate change. Unless we're actually doing something, the atmosphere doesn't change. So I would much rather spend my time talking to people that are concerned and motivating them to do something about it than to worry about the rump of people who I regard frankly as stupid and frankly as stubborn. I'm not going to waste my breath on those people. Everybody needs to act. I mean, you know, if somebody puts solar panels on their roof because they're a greenie tree hugger like me, or if a conservative right-winger puts solar panels on their roof because they want to save on their power bills, the impact on the atmosphere is exactly the same regardless of the motivation. So in a sense, what people think is irrelevant. It's actually what they do. So one of the keys to getting more action, of course, is to present those actions in a positive way that have multiple co-benefits, not just for the atmosphere and for the climate, but for your economy, for your health, for all sorts of other things. There's usually, for most climate change actions that are good ideas, there are multiple benefits of them, and sometimes you just have to emphasise different benefits. Well, look, even people in a wealthy country like Australia are being affected. We have lots of people, for example, that live on the fringes of urban areas surrounded by highly flammable bushland. And yes, we've always had bushfires, but now we're getting more, they're getting worse, and they're occurring over far greater parts of the year. We're also getting increased flooding in places. We're getting increased, longer, more severe droughts. We're getting more intense cyclones. All of those cause either immediate damage or long-term damage. Now, some of the practical consequences of that, if we just think about flooding, for example, there are parts now of Queensland where you cannot insure your house against flooding. Now, for most people, their house is their castle and their number one asset if they own it. Once you can't insure an asset, it basically becomes essentially worthless. So, you know, just the insurance aspects of dealing with severe climatic events are driving a lot of changes. If you're living in a lovely coastal property right on the edge of the ocean, very expensive coastal property and a very nice place to live, we are seeing more and more that those coastal properties are becoming, in many parts of Australia and the world, under great threat. And in fact, many local governments, for example, are promoting the idea that those places will no longer be livable in the future, and those coastal properties will need to be abandoned and whole communities will need to retreat. Those are enormous changes facing even wealthy people, and sometimes the most wealthy people. You know, droughts are affecting our agricultural communities enormously. In Australia, we are fairly used to droughts, but our droughts are getting longer and more severe and hotter, and that has an enormous impact on agricultural incomes and therefore on the livelihoods and community structure of rural and regional communities. So different sorts of climatic impacts are having different effects on different parts of society, but almost everybody will be affected in some way. We also tend to spend a lot of money cleaning up rather than preparing in the first place. In fact, the figures that I've seen are that in terms of so-called natural disasters that of course are becoming quite unnatural, about 95% of the cost of those is spent cleaning up and about 5% on making preparation for in the first place, let alone ameliorating climate change in the first place to reduce those impacts in the distant future. So yes, we tend to have it, we tend to be very reactionary as human beings. We respond to things after the fact quite well. We don't prepare for disaster very well at all. Humans find transitioning from one state to another very difficult. But we've done it. We've done it right throughout our history, or we wouldn't be where we are today. Humans are also fairly conservative about change. They worry about change. But change is being thrust upon us, whether we like it or not. So yes, we do have to be prepared to move, to change, to transition. And once again, we need to emphasise the benefits of those things rather than always the costs.
Shouldn't we maybe change the term rather than change, which may be a bit more daunting, say evolution, it's a normal.
Of course, some of the people who are climate denialists are deniers of evolution as well, so maybe that's not the right word, but I think once again we have to talk about the co-benefits. Not everybody. There'll be differential impacts on different groups of people, even within a society, let alone between different societies. But as I think John F. Kennedy once said, you don't do something because it's easy, you have to do it because it's hard. California is a really interesting example. So California has a lot of very fire-prone vegetation, just like Australia does. It's called the chaparral, and fire ecologists have been studying it for a long time. California is a very wealthy state and has a huge fire service and abundant resources for fighting fires. The fires that occurred there in 2018 were completely and utterly out of control. It was the largest set of fires that California had ever seen. 14,000 houses were lost, a whole town was wiped out. There was nearly 100 people lost their lives, and that was in a place where there was almost unlimited amounts of resources devoted to firefighting. That is not the case virtually anywhere else. It's certainly not the case in Australia. So under those conditions, with the firefighting resources that we have, one can only imagine what the impact might be. If California can't keep fires under control, basically no other state can. I think the traditional, the way that people think about climate scientists, and I'm not a climate scientist, I'm a climate change scientist, but traditionally the climate scientists that actually study and model the climate, in some ways they're a lot less relevant to the problem now than lots and lots of other groups of people, because they've made the case, they've explained the process. They continue to make projections about the future, but it's really a matter of refinement of the models, which is keeping on going on, and the models are getting better all the time. But the message hasn't changed for decades. So in a sense, the job of those people has pretty much been done. They might not agree with that assessment, but it's all relative. I think what we really need a lot more attention on is the engineering solutions, is the market solutions, is the social scientists that are bringing communities along and helping us understand how to communicate better, those sorts of things. To me, that's where the emphasis should be going now. I think the climate science community has done a fantastic job at getting us to the point of knowledge that we're in now. But those people don't have the levers of decision making or the power to act upon the science and the knowledge that we have. So in a sense, it's other groups of people that really need to step up to act on the basis of that knowledge to change things. Mm-hmm. Just getting a better and better climate model isn't going to change anything. So yes, Angela Merkel came out and said Germany will be out of coal by 2038. Yeah. On the one hand, that seems like a good idea. On the other hand, 2038's way too late. Yes, Glencore was reluctantly drawn kicking and screaming to the point where they said they're actually going to move out of coal as well. And they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest coal company in the world, under the pressure from activist shareholders, because those shareholders also see there's money to be made in renewables and in digging up the sorts of minerals and other resources that go into making solar panels, for example, or batteries or hydrogen or whatever. So yes, there's all sorts of, every day I get an email news feed on climate and energy news, and most days there's lots and lots and lots of good news stories, and there's a smattering of bad news stories as well. It's very complex. Even if I read about climate change all day, every day, I couldn't keep up, and I don't want to do that anyway. Once again, for my own mental health. Look, people often ask me if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and it's much more complicated than that. Some days something good will happen and I'll think, okay, that's great. Other days I'll think, still have to bang my head against a brick wall. So there are complex emotions that are generated by being in the climate change space. And it depends on the day, it depends on the hour. Once again, as I said before, you just have to carry on regardless. If you're having a bad day because there's been a stupid article in the Australian or whatever, which I don't usually read, well, you just have to kind of brush that aside and keep going, I think. I worry about my children's future. My kids are both in their early 20s, so they haven't had children yet, so I don't have grandchildren. I'd like to have grandchildren one day. I'm not one of these people that say, well, we're just going to stop reproducing as a human race because of this, because once again, I think it's a very natural human drive to want to perpetuate into the future, selfishly or not. So yes, I do worry about my kids' future. I certainly would worry about my hypothetical grandchildren's future. And those concerns are really a very large part of the motivation that I had. I got into climate change because it seemed like an interesting and worthwhile thing to do back in the early 90s. It was not the political or economic or controversial topic then that it is now. Very few people thought about it. Certainly very few people argued about it. But it seemed like something different to what I'd been doing before and interesting from an intellectual point of view. And it was only after getting into it that you get so sucked in, because you then realise it's so important that once you're in the climate change space, you never get out of it. I don't know anybody that's ever gone into climate change as a researcher or an advocate or anything else and then moved out of that and done something completely different, because I actually think that's an impossible thing to do, because you do realise how important it is, and you do realise that virtually anything else you could do personally with your life is actually quite trivial. And I do often wonder, I look at some of my colleagues sometimes in my department, which is a biology department, and they all accept the climate change science, absolutely, but they're all working on a variety of other things that sometimes I look at and I think, well, how could you possibly spend your time doing that? Because that really doesn't matter. But then I look around society and there's an awful lot of people doing stuff that doesn't matter, really, in the greater scheme of things. So all I can do is just stay true to my own values, informed by the knowledge that I have, and do what I can. People often will say to me, oh, have you read this book about climate change or that book about climate change? Because there's a huge number of popular books about climate change, and usually I say, actually no. If I have any downtime, I like to read detective novels or other sorts of fiction, because I can't just do climate change all the time, So you have to, it's hard to switch off. But you do have to do it, because there's a whole heap of things that I like to do with my life that have nothing to do with climate change, and I'm not going to be, I think it's really, really unhealthy doesn't do the atmosphere any good if I go mad, you know. Well, look, the number one thing that everybody over the 18 can do is vote, and to make sure that your elected representatives know why you are voting or not voting for them. So if here in Australia, for example, the proportion of the population that's concerned about climate change is in the sort of 70+%. Now, that is way over a majority of people. If every one of those people actually made climate change policy and sustainability their number one voting issue, we would get a lot of change very quickly. Our problem is that even though people are concerned, they don't make it the number one issue, and they'll vote for other reasons. So vote is number one. Secondly, money is important. I personally have my superannuation in a fund that does not invest in fossil fuels, and that's a relatively easy thing to do. It takes a phone call. You can also put your money in a bank that does not fund fossil fuel projects, and there's a great website called Market Forces where you can go and you can find a list of banks that do and do not invest in fossil fuels, and you can move your money accordingly. So those are things that are really easy to do. They take a phone call or a few keystrokes. It's not like you have to go and tie yourself to a coal loader or anything. So those things are important. You can do things in your own lives, bike to work, or have an electric vehicle with a battery and solar panels. Eating less meat is actually really important, that many people, including myself, are actually actively doing. All sorts of things like that. We can just buy less stuff. Everything we buy is made using some sort of energy. There's very little manufacturing processes yet that are carbon neutral. So the less stuff you buy, the less you consume, the better you are from a sustainability perspective in all sorts of resources as well as energy. And we need to keep talking about it and going on marches and all of those sorts of things. But most people can do lots of things in their daily lives to live more lightly on the planet. People do come up and say, look, I do feel powerless because I'm only one person. Yeah. And I think there's a great example of the power of one person that's in the last couple of months, which is the 15-year-old girl in Sweden, Greta Thunberg, I think, who just decided off her own bat that she would take every Friday and go and sit with a little cardboard sign outside the Parliament because she just got fed up. And she has, that one kid, set off this amazing youth movement. I went to the climate march here in Sydney a few weeks ago with my kids, and it was incredible, how articulate and passionate these really young people were. They're angry, they are really, really angry, and they're channeling their anger in a very productive way. And of course, there were youth movements and anger before Greta came along, but she really sort of captured the emotion of a generation, I think. She's a very plain speaker. A few months later, she's in Davos talking to the World Economic Forum. I mean, how extraordinary is that?
Right after David Attenborough.
Right after David Attenborough. So, the power of one is around us all the time. But even if it's just to get rid of some plastic product out of our local cafe, well, that's something, I had an email from a young man at my university who I know is an early career academic who who read something that I had written, the article in the Monthly, where I talked about, from a very personal perspective, my attitudes to this issue. And he said it made him want to throw his career in. He also has a young child, and actually do something else. And he was writing this email to me yesterday about, you tell me what I need to do, what career do I need, and I'm willing to change it and just do that thing. And I said, well, look, let's just have a coffee and talk about this, because, these are big decisions for you to make, and they should rely on more than just reading one article. But I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion, especially people when they look at their young kids and they do the math and they think, okay, by the time this young child is in middle age or even in their 20s, we're going to have a very different world. And it really is focusing people's minds on the future, not just for them, but for their offspring and the people they care about the most. And I do think it's a very powerful way of communicating what we need to do, is to actually communicate it through thinking about future generations. It's incredibly important. We have to carry on always as if it's not too late. If we give up, if we lose hope, then it is too late by definition. While ever we think we have a chance of turning things around, we have to keep going. So for me, hope is a strategy rather than an emotion.